Good evening and welcome to the return of our Fourscore Speaker Series. Tonight we are thrilled to have Dr. Jon Grinspan with us to discuss his latest book, Wide Awake, The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War. My name is Phyllis Evans and I'm the Senior Director of Development of the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation is the only national foundation focused on increasing access to history, educational programs, exhibits, and sites highlighting the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. We do our work in cooperation and partnership with others locally, nationally, and globally, and our vision is for a world where freedom and democracy flourish, inspired and work of Abraham Lincoln. For more information on how you can be a support of this mission, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box below and we'll get to as many as possible. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thank you again for joining us as we kick off the fall 2024 season of Lincoln Presidential Foundation's Fourscore Speaker Series. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Jon Grinspan to discuss his latest book, Wide Awake, The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War, about what the publisher calls, quote, history's most surprising, most consequential political club, the Wide Awake Anti-Slavery Youth Movement. In this book, Dr. Grinspan examines how our nation crossed that threshold from a political campaign into a war. And Wide Awake bears witness to the power of protest, the fight for majority rule, and the defense of free speech. At its core, Wide Awake illuminates a question American democracy keeps posing: the precarious relationship between violent speech and violent actions. Jon Grinspan is Curator of Political History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. His work explores the deep history and fraught present of American democracy. He's the award-winning author of 3 books, The Virgin Vote, The Age of Acrimony, and most recently, Wide Awake. Grinspan frequently contributes op-eds to the New York Times and elsewhere, and has been profiled by The New Yorker, The Guardian, and The Washington Post. And as a Smithsonian curator, he collects objects from contemporary political events, primaries, conventions, protests, etc., to help tell the story of America's past and present to museum goers in the future. Jon, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me, Erin. It's really a pleasure to join you to talk about this.
Jon, we're delighted to have you. And to start things off, our audience is always interested in the author's professional journey. Can you tell us what led you to your career as a historian and to being a curator of political history in particular?
Oh, it's a good question. I don't know. It depends how psychological you want to get. If you want to go way back, as a child, my grandparents came to this country as refugees, as Holocaust refugees, and I grew up with a sense from a young age that history is something that happens to people, and it's not in textbooks, it's not on battlefields, it's something that happens to your grandmother or whatever. And so I always loved history and was really passionate about it, but felt often like American history sometimes was told in a kind of mythic way that lacked that personal feeling, that you can make things so kind of monumental that you lose that human element and you lose track of the fact that these events happen to real human beings. I went to get a PhD, thought I wanted to be an academic historian, and I got tired of talking to the same 6 experts and really having this tiny little circle of expertise. And people would say, I went home to Thanksgiving dinner and my grandpa tried to talk to me about history and it was so frustrating. Well, it seems to me like our job as historians is to talk to your grandpa, and so, or your uncle or your aunt or whomever. So I really tried to lean into speaking to the public, writing for the public. I'm lucky enough to have gotten this crazy job at the Smithsonian, where the Smithsonian exists for the American public. It's owned by the public. Our goal is the increase in diffusion of knowledge to the American public. So having the full American public as our constituent really reminds me that you tell these stories, you have to really reach beyond the ivory tower and again try to tell these human stories. So I found out about the Wide Awakes a long time ago, and they just keep coming back, and I just keep studying them more and more. And so after 17 years, it was finally time to publish a book on them.
Thanks, Jon. In your book, you do reference how you first got interested in the history of the Wide Awakes while you were studying at the University of Virginia, where you received your master's and your PhD. What first drew you to the story of this significant movement, and what prompted you to revisit it for this book so many years later?
Yeah, it's funny. I originally got interested in the wide awakes because it was so obscure. And one of these things, one of those like, I can't believe that happened in American history stories. And the more you dig, the more you realize the size, the scale, the impact of this movement that I think almost none of us were taught about and barely show up in books. So I kind of liked it because it seemed like a little like shard from the past, a splinter of history that I could pull out and introduce to people. And then over the years, two things happened. One, as a curator at the Smithsonian, people kept reaching out to me with more and more evidence. They'd find their diaries from an ancestor who was a wide awake, or they'd find a wide awake object in their attic, or a wide awake banner on auction, and they'd want to talk about the movement. Meanwhile, modern people were getting excited about the movement and showing up with wide awake tattoos and stuff and wanting to talk about the wide awakes. And then at the same time, what had once seemed obscure, this grassroots mass combative political movement, started to look more and more like our political present in some interesting ways, in some disconcerting ways. I mean, I learned about the wide awakes at UVA in 2017. The Unite the Right rally happened in Charlottesville, and neo-Nazis with torches marched by the building where I first learned about the wide awake. So it seemed like this movement from the past was talking to what was happening in the present. And what had once been interesting because it was so obscure was now interesting because it was so relevant and it spoke to the moment. And as a historian, the history has happened. It should be static, but our worlds change as we study things, and that's just plain fact. So trying to look at them as a movement over time and see how they change and the perspective change has been really interesting for me.
That's really interesting, John. And it also reminds me of when you talked about, I think your professor typed in the search term wide awakes and just like the sheer volume of hits. And of course, not all of them were specifically about this movement that you talk about in your book, but it also, to your point, reminds us that there are so many different perspectives that go into our understanding of history. And sometimes there are perspectives that, for one reason or another, are omitted from the dominant narrative. And that's one of the things that comes through in this book, that here's a movement that we should not be sleeping on, that we should that we should be awake to, if you will.
Right? I like that.
Yeah, we don't
okay,
want to be
very good.
on the wide awakes. There we go. I just found that really interesting, and it ties into what you just said too. So I'd love to talk a little bit about how the wide awakes emerged in this really intense political atmosphere in Hartford, Connecticut. What made that particular city and moment ripe for such a movement to take hold and spread? And then if you can weave it in there, please tell us about the 5 originals.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about all that stuff. With the searching to begin with, I have to say this because people often talk about how difficult their research was. It wasn't even hard to find these guys. They're everywhere. Once you start looking in the newspapers, in the diaries, in the letters, in the memoirs and reminiscences, the wide awakes are so present. I didn't even really have to do crazy digging to find sources. I certainly did go to lots of historical societies, but they're so present if you just look, that the story has to be told. So the wide awakes start in Hartford, and it's not the kind of city most people associate with the Civil War or angry mass movements in the street. Hartford is one of the wealthiest cities in America at the time. In 1860, it's a orderly, fairly calm Yankee city, but Hartford is located. A couple of things are important about Hartford. One is it's about as far north as you can go in America and still have a politically contested part of the nation. That many of you know about the coming of the Civil War, as many of you probably do. There's a deep South that is growing more and more extremely pro-slavery, and there's a far Yankee North that is leaning into abolition, but is toying with different questions about how to address the slavery issue. And then there's a big middle, and then there's the New Yorks and the Philadelphias and the Baltimores, all the way down to the Richmonds, where people are deciding on the ground between these factions. There's really a huge moderate middle in the nation. That's where most people live in the country. That's where the political parties win elections. Hartford's about as far north as you can go into Yankee New England and still have Democratic Party winning mayoral elections and still contesting the state. It's also a state with a really high literacy rate, the highest literacy rate at the time. And it also has a lot of young people who felt stuck. It's a state that famously has kind of an old elite population that ran it, that had less social mobility than a California or an Illinois or a state further west where people are constantly coming to. And so it has a lot of young people who are reading the newspapers, arguing the politics, and feeling politically blocked by the contested nature of American politics and socially blocked by being young people in a state run by what they call old fogeyism. So they're kind of primed politically, geographically, socially for a eruption, and the wide awakes come along to give them that opportunity, I guess.
Yeah. One of the striking elements of the wide awakes was their use of militaristic uniforms, imagery, the torchlit parades. They somehow hit on this very simple formula for creating a mass movement. How did their blend of political theater and order help energize young voters and would-be voters? Some of them weren't even of voting age or eligible to vote themselves at that time.
Yeah, probably a quarter of wide awakes were too young to vote based on the numbers we have. Oh, I should also talk about the originals in answering that question.
Yeah.
So there's some guys in Hartford, right? Eddie Jurgensen's the main one. He's 19 years old. He's a clerk. He works in a textile store. He lives in a textile store. He makes $50 a year. He's too young to vote. He's never voted. He's pretty low on the political totem pole, but he wants to participate in a political rally. And do you want me to tell the whole story or just abbreviate it?
It's a great story, so I'd love you to tell as much as you can. But
okay, I'll tell it quickly.
Yeah.
All right. There's a political rally across from his textile store. Cassius Clay, the abolitionist Kentucky speaker, is going to give a speech and have a torchlit march afterwards. This young guy, Eddie Jurgensen, wants to participate in the march, but he's basically, long story short, he's worried about getting oil from the torch on his clothing, on his new jacket. So he works in a textile store. He goes to the waterproof fabric section, the kind of oilcloth area of the store, and cuts himself a makeshift cape. He throws it on. He puts the torch on a curtain rod, so it's on a 6-foot rod, and it looks cool. It looks dynamic. His 4 buddies, who are also clerks at the store, make their own capes, make their own torches. So when this anti-slavery event, this Republican event, lets out at the very beginning of the 1860 election, into the night in Connecticut in the cold, there are these 5 guys in capes with torches standing to greet them. And people see the dynamism and the power of this symbol. They don't quite have it all worked out yet, but from there, they build this movement, the wide awakes. Young people in Hartford start signing up, start joining. They kind of, to lead into your question, Aaron, they design it in a militaristic company organization. They elect a captain, lieutenants, they choose matching uniforms and matching capes, and they start marching and drilling in columns, basically in the streets of Hartford at night. They get Major James Hardy's drill book on how to march and how to march on a battlefield, and they start training on a really militaristic function. And that sends a couple messages. One, it sends a message to their enemies, to local Democrats, pro-slavery forces, that they mean business, that they're willing to fight. And one of their main functions early on is as bodyguards and as escorts for political speakers who frequently get attacked. The other thing is they look really orderly. I mean, they are marching in lockstep, in silence. They're turning at these columns of young men marching through the night in uniforms in a society that looks like it's crumbling because of these fights over slavery, where new parties are splitting in half every week and parties die, new parties are forming. The wide awakes are able to signal structure, uniformity, stability, order. And so a lot of people who thought anti-slavery was too radical, the wide awakes look the opposite. They look really stable. And so they really start to take off because they broadcast this very physically with simple things, their uniforms, their caps, their torches, their marching.
Well, and you also talk about if I'm remembering this correctly from the book, the silence, like it wasn't a rowdy thing. So in addition to the orderliness, there's in some cases sort of an eerie silence to them, but they're specifically not a rowdy political organization. Is that accurate?
Yes, and you kind of have to situate yourself in what a normal 19th century rally looks like, or a torchlit parade looks like. It's pretty messy. It's pretty, the visitors come from Europe and are kind of stunned. It's pretty drunken often. I mean, there are temperance advocates in America, but there's often whiskey, lager, cider at these rallies. It's out in the street. It's at night. People are marching in these kind of jumbled bands, yelling to their friends, shooting off fireworks randomly. They're usually dogs and young children running along, maybe people firing revolvers in the air. It's pretty wild looking, and it signals that this democracy is kind of chaotic and ragged. And the wide awakes do the opposite. They march in silence. They're not allowed to be drunk while marching. They're not allowed to smoke cigars while marching. And smoking cigars is a big part of 19th century political life. Drinking is also. They really stand out, and to their admirers and to people who are won over, it looks like these people have a path forward. They have a model for some kind of stability and order in American life. But if you don't like the guys in uniforms who are marching through your town in silence with torches at night, it's really ominous. It kind of has a magnifying effect in either direction. It wins over a lot of moderates who are not on the anti-slavery side yet, and it scares off a lot of people at the same time.
Yeah. So out of that 5 originals, sort of opportunistically finding, oilcloth and being part of this event, you write about the rapid expansion of the wide awakes and how quickly they grew across the North, in particular, in both cities and rural areas where the majority of the U.S. population lived, also in more contested cities in the North or on border in what eventually became border states. How did they achieve that? You talk about their social and communication structures that facilitate this rapid expansion and uniformity. Like there's a formula, if you will. Can you talk about how they were able to achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. They originally are bodyguards, right? They're there to defend speakers. They turn into a franchise, basically. And it's not a coincidence that the people who organize this are textile salesmen, are kind of Yankee businessmen or wannabe businessmen, because they franchise it out. The original Hartford people who form the club, they start printing up pamphlets on how to be a wide awake with kind of fill in the blank information on how to drill, how to elect leaders, how you march, what you do on election day. And they send them all across the North. So we've seen them, they show up in historical societies in Illinois, in California. They're really reaching a broad network. They pack up the capes, the uniforms, and send them out as models. When Chicago hosts the Republican convention in May, the textile salesmen and the textile shops there start selling wide awake uniforms so that a delegate from Pennsylvania might go to Illinois, go to Chicago for the convention, buy a cape, and go back to central Pennsylvania and form their own club. It really starts to bubble up around the North. And it's fairly embracing. You can get the uniforms, you can march, as long as you can agree that slavery has too much power in America and that there's a slave power. You can be really diverse in many other forms. I mean, there are wide awakes who are recent immigrants. There are wide awakes who are former know-nothings. There are wide awakes who are radical abolitionists. There are wide awakes who are conservative and deeply racist. There are African-American wide awakes eventually. There are white wide awakes. It really is an encompassing model. It's very modular. And at the same time, it looks like a mass movement. It really looks from 30,000 feet like there are, well, they believe there are 500,000 wide awakes in the country. That number is probably not true. It's a nation of 31 million people. 500,000 wide awakes is too many, but there are several 100,000 by the end of the summer, by maybe September 1860. This movement that was 5 guys in March is now a movement of hundreds of thousands of people. And it's because it is kind of embracing, it's kind of applicable to many different people. And it fits what Henry Adams, the writer and historian, called the systematic organization of hatreds, which he says is the field of politics. It's kind of a dark vision of politics, but they can agree who they dislike and who they're marching against. And that's better than arguing over all the minutiae and all the hard questions about slavery, because there's no easy answer to abolition, to any of these questions for most Americans at the time, but they can agree to march in the same direction against the same opponents.
Absolutely. Like they might agree on the problem, but not necessarily the solutions or the scope of the problem.
Yes.
Well, this also, you just answered in part one of the first questions we had from Carol, who asked if all the wide awakes were white. And it was predominantly made up of young white men. But as you referenced, there were, it was a relatively diverse movement. There were people of color who participated in different ways. There were some women who participated in different ways. There was a women's club that formed. One of the stories that really sticks out for me in your book is the story of Lewis Hayden. So I wondered if you can describe the diversity of the movement, but also how it required a level of trust for some individuals to take part in it. And I feel like the Lewis Hayden story just is very illustrative of that.
Yeah, it's amazing. Hayden is a fugitive enslaved person originally. He was born in Kentucky, he was enslaved. He had his first son sold away into slavery. He really, I mean, I don't mean to belabor this, everybody suffers in slavery. He really had an extremely hard life and escaped with his wife, Harriet. They become activists and they kind of begin to anchor the Boston fugitive slave community. They really become the representatives of this community, their houses where a lot of fugitive slaves hide out. Over the 1850s, they get more and more confrontational to the point where Lewis Hayden is, he shoots a gun at federal authorities trying to rescue a fugitive slave. In 1860, the Wide Awakes are forming, and they are a white movement, basically. I mean, we can talk about diversity means something different in 1860. They're incredibly diverse by 1860 standards. There certainly are African American voters in New England and activists, but the idea of joining in a movement like this has not happened in American history yet. And Lewis Hayden organizes the West Boston Colored Wide Awakes, which is a club in West Boston where most fugitive slaves live. Of 144 people, it kind of grows to maybe 200 who get the uniforms, march in wide awake rallies, march among clubs of entirely white people. So there'd be a rally of 10,000 wide awakes in Boston, and you'd have Lewis Hayden and his 250 African American wide awakes marching. It really takes guts to do this. I mean, we kind of assume everyone is going to stand up and get active, but to be an African American in a military uniform marching in a sea of white people, so for a candidate, is a really bold thing and a physically dangerous thing. And also Lincoln, who's the nominee, we left him out, but Lincoln, we'll talk about Lincoln a little later. He's not an abolitionist. He is not on the far radical end of things. And so it's not easy for the African American community to go out and march for this guy who they know is pretty lukewarm. And of the maybe top 10 options of, nominees in 1860 for the Republican Party, isn't even near the top of those who are most anti-slavery. Clay would have been more anti-slavery, maybe Seward as well. So it's contested and debated in the African American community as well. But Hayden starts this club. We also have African wide awakes in Oberlin, Ohio, some in Portland, Maine. We have female clubs, as you mentioned, being formed in Seneca Falls and Chatham, New York, in Charlotte, New York. At Mount Holyoke, there's a wide awake rally. But the real diversity of the movement is ethnic and, more importantly, class diversity. It's a grassroots political movement, and it's being run on the ground by factory workers, clerks, policemen, boot blacks, railroad employees. This is a movement, this is a political system that's still very hierarchical, and yet the people running the Wide Awakes are too young to have voted in any previous election. And, the guy who invents it makes $50 a year. It's not an elite movement. And that class diversity is really unusual in history. And it makes it not easy for the elite leaders of the party to operate with them. So I would say by the standards of 1860, it's an extremely diverse movement, but our expectations for diversity in 2024 look a little different.
Right. Carol also had a question, just as a reminder, what was the voting eligibility at that time? How old did you have to be?
21 across the board. That's until the 1970s. There are places in the nation, it's really important to remember, where African Americans can vote in much of New England, but it doesn't usually line up with where large Black populations are. So the states that are the fewest African Americans are more likely to give them the vote. But in Maine, in Massachusetts, in New York, if you have enough money, in a couple other states, there are African American voters.
James has a question that relates to where we're headed in this conversation anyway, which is he wants to know what Lincoln's reaction was, but I'm going to broaden that a little bit. How did any of the prospective Republican nominees, Seward, Lincoln, et cetera, interact with the Wide Awakes before and after the Republican National Convention?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess the way you phrase it, maybe we can talk politicians in general and Lincoln in particular. The Wide Awakes present Republican politicians with a really difficult situation because they are so enthusiastic and they're so fired up and they're so unusual and they're so grassroots and unconnected from the political establishment that Wide Awakes have this habit of just showing up at politicians' houses in the middle of the night with a brass band, with torches, with bonfires, and singing outside Seward's house or Carl Schuertz's house, and waking up politicians who do not expect people to be trampling on their roses. William Henry Seward he's a really fascinating guy. He's got a good sense of humor. He's a great politician, but he turns out he really likes to sleep. And there are many, many accounts of him throwing open his window in the middle of the night and saying, "Come back tomorrow. What are you doing here?" Over time, people like Seward, people like Carl Schurz, Cassius Clay, some of the governors like Andrew Curtin, they learned that they really have to work with these wide awakes, that they have too good an asset in the wide awakes to tell them to go home and go to sleep. That from the perspective of anti-slavery movements, all along, anti-slavery movements have failed to have mass numbers behind them. Things like the Liberty Party never won a majority of a county anywhere in a presidential election in America. There have been the ideals, there have been the politicians, they haven't had the numbers. Finally, the Republican anti-slavery movement in the wide awakes has boots on the ground, guys in the street marching in support of you, and people like Seward learn to court them and to joke with them and make a lot of wide awake puns, awake versus asleep, and really learn to see the wide awakes as an asset. But it's a learning curve because they're so unusual and they're so kind of pushy in how they interact with people. Lincoln is a little bit of a different story. Lincoln has a strange initial introduction to the wide awakes. After the wide awakes form, the first person they happen to escort as a bodyguard through Hartford is Lincoln, because he's traveling in New England after the Cooper Union speech. And he gives a speech in Hartford. It's a good speech. He comes out into the night, and these guys with torches and uniforms escort him back to his hotel. We don't quite know what he thought about that. But we do get glimmer, and the wide awakes love Lincoln. They make him an honorary member. They invite him to meetings. They or call themselves Lincoln Wide Awakes. The fact that they are working class and laboring, the fact that they are young, kind of syncs up with Lincoln's popular appeal, right? Really, his roots, his appeal in many ways, it just works very well with the wide awakes, and they really like that. He's cautious about the wide awakes. He writes. He doesn't write much. He never says anything bad about the wide awakes. There are a couple moments where he writes things like, "My friends believe that political spectacle will kind of win the day, and these wide awake events with these rallies and these torches will fire people up. But I know that counting noses is how you win an election." And Lincoln, like most 19th century politicians, believed that the way you win votes is you buttonhole people in saloons, at church, at the store, whatever it be, and talk to them one on one. This is political bosses across the 19th century believe this. And so Lincoln is looking at these guys marching around torches and thinking, that's not how we're going to win this. But the wide awakes keep coming. They show up at his house. That famous photograph of Lincoln's house surrounded by supporters, August 8th, 1860, they're wide awakes in that crowd. That big rally in Springfield is organized in large part by the Springfield wide awakes, who have young guys, secretaries, inviting wide awakes from all over Illinois, Iowa, Missouri to come to this rally. He learns to work with them, but he never is gung-ho for the wide awakes. And as the election turns into secession, he runs into many other challenges with the movement.
Yeah. Well, and they were able to convert, though, right, from spectacle to counting noses, if you will. Yes. You cover how they're able to not only energize and embolden Republicans, but mobilize them as well. While some of those same actions provoked panic in the South, contributing to secession. So can you expand a little more on the impact of the movement and what that had on Southern perceptions of republicanism, too?
Yes, there are plenty of people in the North who are thrilled about the wide awakes, and plenty of people in the South and Northern Democrats who see it as the end of the Republic, who really see, legitimately, let's be fair to them, these are partisan, as they see it, paramilitary marchers filling the streets of Hartford and New York and Chicago and Kalamazoo and St. Louis and all these parts of America. It really looks like a fundamental norm of American democracy, that you keep militarism, that you keep violence, that you keep menace away from politics, is being violated. And it looks that way to Northern Democrats too, who say, when did this become okay? It looks even more ominous to Southerners who are further away and getting distorted information. People are, if you're living in New Orleans or Charleston or Huntsville or wherever, it's really hard to find out what the wide awakes in Ohio are actually doing. But you're getting reports, regular reports from September on, that the wide awakes are armed, that they're marching with carbines under their capes and revolvers under their capes, that they're practicing to throw aside their torches and get rifles, that they're planning an invasion of the South. When African American wide awakes emerge, you get disinformation in the South and in the border North that all wide awakes are African Americans, or most wide awakes are African Americans, and you get fake ads in places like Wheeling, Virginia then, and in Pittsburgh, claiming to be organizing African American wide awakes clubs in those cities. We know there are no African American wide awake clubs in those cities. That's disinformation to scare people. A lot of the news people in the South are getting from the wide awakes, they're getting from Northern Democrats who are using fear of the wide awakes to get people to turn out and vote for the Democratic Party, kind of amping up the anxiety. And then they're active secessionists who've been plotting for quite some time to secede and really hoping to break the parties, honestly and explicitly, and point to the wide awakes and say they're coming to kill us. And so there's this campaign of disinformation, campaign of fear and panic. But if you read the accounts of how ordinary people felt, you get a sense of their terror. I mean, maybe one of the best examples is there's this 15-year-old girl, Betty Ann Graham, who's from Southern Virginia, but she's going to boarding school in Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia wide awakes are marching out under her window on Spruce Street, holding demonstrations, cheering in the night. And it's really ominous to this young Virginia girl who feels like they're marching against her family. Now, a lot of this is disinformation. The wide awakes are not violent. They are not organizing to do anything more than win an election at this point. But that's not how it looks in the darkness and at the peak of this election.
Thanks, John. We have a question from Greg, and he's noting something, but it's a good opportunity to talk about, okay, we had wide awakes organizing for the Republicans. Was there an analog to this on the Democrat side or in the South? So he says the South reacted to this movement by forming its countervailing one called the Minuteman, and there were some other groups as well. How did those groups compare with the wide awakes? And in the Civil War, did any regiments recruited from wide awakes and Minutemen fight against each other in the battlefield? So that's foreshadowing, Greg, a little bit about where this is headed. But John, can you address that? Like, so they were able to galvanize this movement on behalf of Republicans. Did people try to respond with something similar? And how successful was or wasn't it, and why?
Yeah, so they get copycat clubs pretty quickly. By the middle of the summer, Northern Democrats are forming the Douglas Invincibles, the Bell Ringers for John Bell and Everett, all these other organizations. And in the North, people it's a lot of people. You can really see them. People in Brooklyn organize the chloroformers to put the wide awakes back to sleep. These clubs are kind of mocked as being not as like a pale imitation of the wide awakes. They're slightly militaristic. They certainly have members. They march with torches in the night. They hold rallies, but they don't have the cohesive organization. They don't march in columns very well. They don't march in silence. They don't have the command structure, and they look sloppy to people. And honestly, the Democratic Party is just split in half. And these kind of rowdy, sloppy rallies of these guys just furthers the sense that the Democratic Party is in chaos, is crumbling, is not a serious political organization. In the South, people start to form clubs as they call offsets. That's the term they use to offset the wide awakes of the North. There's a great account of a young man in New Orleans who joins a club because when he learns about the wide awakes, his instinct is wide awake to what? Kind of what are you saying here exactly? And so he joins a Breckenridge club, a Southern Democratic club. In New Orleans and Charleston, St. Louis, you get these clubs, Minutemen, that kind of thing, with different names in different places that march, they ride horses, they wear uniforms, they start to lean into militarism. I think the most impactful clubs are actually in Baltimore and DC. We don't think of that as the South. Yep. It really is in 1860. Practice of slavery, people see themselves as Southerners, and Southern Democrats in Baltimore and DC form this organization called the National Volunteers, which is training, organizing, even already arming to stop the wide awakes if they come to Washington. They say this explicitly. There's an inquiry in Congress in February 1861 about this, and they say, yeah, we organize to stop the wide awakes, and if they come down, we'll be ready. And they're fairly shady, but one thing we know is that several members of the Capitol Police at the time were members of the National Volunteers. And so this movement, this kind of Southern militia, political militia, is threaded through the police force, is getting connected to the military, and this is really ominous. I don't have to say that. By the peak of the 1860 election, by November 1860, there are many hundreds of thousands of young men in pseudo-military political organizations marching in clubs, talking about what's going to happen after the election. It's no surprise that you have a civil war not too long later. And it's really important to see that a year before that civil war, you have all these people marching in military uniforms and organizations. It doesn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah, this comes up again and again in your book in sort of different ways, where you talk about how the movement was born out of this frustration over the violent suppression of free speech, particularly around slavery, violence in Congress, violence against public speakers, violence against the press. So in effect, you recount how Southern slaveholding members of Congress are bullying anti-slavery politicians, expecting them to always back down, and eventually they don't. And then eventually you get the wide awakes that are formed, if I understand correctly, really more as, at least initially, as a defensive force. They're defending speakers from violent attacks. One of the points that you then also make, which is echoed throughout the book, is that usually in history, when movements warn of cabals and conspiracies, they're scapegoating boogeymen. But in this case, slave power was an exception. That's the slave power that they were organizing against was real. It amounted to, quote, a pyramid scheme disfiguring American democracy. So when you have these other organizations forming in response to the wide awakes, or like you mentioned, the young man who joined a club in New Orleans and said, wide awake to what? How much self-awareness is there that, I mean, to put this in simple terms, that they've poked the bear, or that, you know, they baited them and now they are contributing to this spiraling situation?
Yeah, spiraling is exactly right. And it's reciprocal. If you could get John Dimitri, the young man in New Orleans, to talk to one of the Hartford wide awakes, they'd use a lot of the same rhetoric and accuse the other side of it. The big hot question in 1860 fundamentally is, who are the radicals? Are the radicals the pro-slavery secessionist leading Democrats who kind of want all or nothing with slavery, or are the radicals the abolitionists who are trying to end slavery and break up the Union? Or not, that's not how they would put it, but that's how their opponents would put it. And there's this back and forth of who's the radicals, and the majority of voters want to vote against the radicals. The wide awakes are good at situating themselves as the less radical option to the majority, to many voters. Can't say the majority of voters because the election is very strange. Yeah, it's reciprocal, and a lot of it has to go with these cultural stereotypes and expectations different populations have over each other. I mean, people in the South live far away from people in the North. It sounds obvious, but it's a big country. There's a great newspaper network, but it's still very diffuse. A lot of Southerners and Northerners for quite some time had said basically, the quote is, you can slap a Yankee in the face and he'll sue you. Basically that the Southerners, the boys in Congress were willing to use violence or willing to use mastery, and the Yankees won't do anything about it. And it's kind of fitting that these Connecticut Yankees start the pushback as soon as they organize, when they're marching and organizing honestly in a very Yankee way, in a very kind of stoic, sober organization. People in the South start to say, look, they're constantly pushing us. And there's just this back and forth. Nobody agrees that they're the good guys and the other side are the bad guys, but it is amazing to see the escalation and the conversation that's going back and forth. Southerners then say, Yankees don't make a lot of threats, but when they follow through, they really follow through. And here are these 500,000 people marching in lockstep coming to get us. So these stereotypes of each other, these misconceptions of each other, this misinformation and this disinformation just leads to an increasingly heated environment. And that's before the election. And there is, over the fall, even before the election, there is violence breaking out. I mean, there's often violence in American politics. The know-nothings had a lot of violence in the 1850s already, but you see these really prominent brawls and confrontations between usually wide awakes and Northern Democrats, but in New York and in Baltimore and in DC and in Wheeling, fights between wide awakes and Southern populations. And there's this growing sense of, Seward said it would be an irrepressible conflict, and people can feel that escalating.
Yeah, it has the feeling of a self-fulfilling prophecy, even though at that point, no one could have predicted exactly what would happen. There were certainly the signs, as you point out. You mentioned New York.
Can I really quickly before that?
Please.
it has a feeling of self-fulfilling prophecy, but there's still people all along saying, oh, this is all a game. This is all a silly election. They're trying to win votes. They're trying to get offices for patronage and spoils. This will all end in a show on November 7th. So it's both at the same time. Sorry, go back to New York.
Absolutely. No, that's an excellent point. I'm glad that you clarified that. You mentioned a particular moment in New York City, which really, and you just, I have to say with your prose, John, you paint these vivid word pictures. So for anyone who has not read this book yet, and I know that Phyllis is putting the link to purchase it in the chat too, you won't be disappointed in this prose because it is phenomenal. There's tremendous research that goes into this, but also just, John, even the way you describe some of these individuals, it's like you describe their personalities through their physical features, which can be kind of devastating at times. I mean, so some of these people are like, to do that. Oh, that's rough. That's pretty tough. But the way you describe this sort of powder keg situation in New York City, with the Wide Awake Club situated right across the street from a hotel that's known as being a Democrat hangout, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats who are vacationing in New York. Can you talk about how that situation in particular in a northern city just spiraled out of control?
Yeah, there are a lot of coincidences in this story that are, on the one hand, strange, on the other hand, show how intimate this whole story is. I mean, the fact that the first person the Wide Awakes escort is Lincoln is one of these coincidences, but one of the biggest is the hotel in New York where Southern guests usually stay, and Tammany Hall politicians like to go drink mint juleps and hang out, is the New York Hotel on Broadway, right by Washington Square. Directly across from this absolute headquarters of kind of the Southern population in New York, which is very influential, is the central Wide Awake headquarters for New York. New York Wide Awakes create a central command structure of the several thousand Wide Awakes in New York City. And they have rallies, they shoot off cannons, they march in the street, and they start to rub up against the Southern guests across the street until one night the Knickerbocker Wide Awakes are kind of massing in the middle of Broadway in the middle of the night, and a supposedly South Carolinian goes across the street and punches one in the face. The Wide Awake commander yells Wide Awake's charge, and these guys go pouring into the guests of the hotel, into the hotel. Those torches on long staffs, sometimes they make great clubs. Some of them are made of pine and just splinter, and others, they're Wide Awake companies that order lead cores for their torch staff so they can really crack some heads with them. The Wide Awakes beat up the guests of the hotel. It turns out the police come, the police arrest some people. The people they arrest are New York Democrats, actually, but it becomes this national story, and you can see it showing up in newspapers in California, in Louisiana, in Michigan. It really spreads. No one's killed. It's not the worst thing that's happened in American politics, but it looks like a set piece of all the players in this kind of spiraling situation in the middle of Broadway coming head to head. And it looks like the thing that makes the Wide Awakes most scary, their militarism, their training, their companies and columns and command structure. It looks like this really could be used for actual violence if somebody wanted to. And then the people in the north, in much of the north, say, thank God, you finally got what you deserve here. So it's vindicating. It's terrifying to some and kind of vindicating to others.
Yeah. We have a few other questions that relate to the people that were involved with Wide Awakes and how they were perceived. So Lee asks if Frederick Douglass joined with or marched with the Wide Awakes at any point, and did his newsletters or publications promote them or comment on them in any way?
Yeah, Douglass himself is in an interesting bind because Douglass, he's really not a Republican. He writes, it's funny, he votes for a fifth party in this fourth party race. He votes for the abolitionist Gerrit Smith, who's really barely running a campaign. But he writes that he wants Lincoln to win. He hopes the Republicans win. He just can't bring himself to vote for them. The Republicans are not mostly abolitionists. They're certainly abolitionist Wide Awakes, but this movement is an anti-slavery extension movement. It's a free speech against slavery movement. It's not as far as Douglass wants people to be. He says the Republicans are plotting a slow siege when he basically wants a sudden invasion. Metaphorically, he's not trying to invade the South. He just sees the tactics as too dilatory and delayed and slow and moderate. So he's not a Wide Awake, but he's definitely paying attention to this race and says it's the most exciting presidential election that has ever happened, basically. And he's following closely. And other African American activists are debating do we side with these people? The wide awake Republicans here, is this finally the anti-slavery army we've been waiting for? Or are these more white people we can't trust, honestly? And there's a really vibrant debate about that. And it's pretty fair considering honestly how racist some of the wide awakes are and how far they are from wanting anything like equality or mostly wanting abolition. It's really shocking that any African Americans would be able to participate in this movement. Not that others would be skeptical of it.
Yeah, and just even some of the slogans on the banners, like it's not.
Oh my God!
It's not something being said quietly. It's something that's being displayed using incredibly racially charged and racist language.
Yeah, they're really
yeah.
Yeah, the wide awakes and the Republicans are really angling for what they see as the abandoned center of American politics. There are all these moderates who don't want to vote for this crazy pro-slavery Democratic Party anymore, and they're trying to pick them up and show that the Republicans aren't abolitionists, and they're doing it by being awfully racist a lot of the time. But then there are other wide awakes who are as close to equality as you're going to get in America. So they really run the gamut.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about the conspiratorial thinking and misinformation that was being put out there about the wide awake movement, and that was also happening with major political figures and leaders at the time too. You note that Southern papers are spreading this story at one point that Seward is traveling across the Midwest, plotting to replace the U.S. Army with wide awakes, and he wasn't. But you also note situations like that the Virginia-born Secretary of War John Floyd began moving federal arsenals from the north to the south, like was actually doing that. Can you tell us about the role of extremist leaders in the South? Henry Wise was an interesting story that you recount in the book. Can you tell us about how that sort of, again, you talk about this spiraling conflict, but you can see how this is being amped up, in particular with the things that some of these extremist leaders are doing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that is mostly post-election, but it is shocking. I mean, so Floyd is after the election, he moves weapons from Pennsylvania, from Missouri, from places to the Deep South, artillery, really conspiring with the Confederacy. There's no other word. He took the oath of office and then worked to aid the enemy of the nation at the time. So it really goes well into conspiracy, and sedition and whatnot. Henry Wise is the former governor of Virginia. He's the governor who was presiding when John Brown launched his raid, and he is really amped up and excited about the possibility of civil war, to the point that mostly after the election, he's going around telling people the wide awakes are going to come kill us. Wide awakes are going to slit our throat. Wide awake Marines are going to invade Norfolk, which is, a large naval facility at the time. There are no wide awake Marines. This is nonsense, but he is going around the state really leaning into this fear of this wide awake boogeyman as a political lever to kind of scare Southerners into secession and into radicalism. There are other people like William Lanzienti in Alabama, who's working to break apart the Democratic Party because he knows that a lot of Southerners are still adherent to the Democratic Party, and it's standing in the way of secession. That as long as they have faith in American institutions, a lot of people won't support secession. So he's actively working to break his own party so it will be easier to secede. And when people like Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, the Illinois Democrat, who is Lincoln's rival, says that he would help oppose secession, people start saying Stephen Douglas is a wide awake, and he and Lincoln and Stephen Douglas are forming a wide awake army together. So there's just so much disinformation and so much willful conspiracy going on.
Yeah. One of the questions we have too is about whether these young people who were wide awakes joined the military early on. And another city that you talk about a lot in this book is St. Louis, and that it was also just this absolute powder keg on the eve of the Civil War post-election, but that it's a tipping point between political and military in terms of the wide awakes role, and how, in states here where it's not just the election and rejecting that democratic process, but also these secession conventions are being held. And Governor Jackson, if I remember correctly, rejects the fact that the convention decided not to secede. And so, similar to what you were talking about with some of these other leaders, he felt like they were standing in the way of secession, and starts conspiring to draw Missouri into the Confederacy. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and why St. Louis isn't remembered as a major tipping point the way Fort Sumter is?
It's funny. I think people who know about St. Louis talk endlessly about just the Missouri War is its own civil war in many ways. It's clearly it's a border state. It's a state that maintains slavery, that has an old Southern elite. But St. Louis is filling up with German immigrants, many of them refugees from the revolutions in '48 who are radical leaning. It has Northern businessmen coming in. It has Frank Blair, who's a Southern elite from a elite political family, but who hates the local Democrats. And there are a lot of wide awakes in St. Louis, and they before the election they have to fight a lot. They're the ones with the lead-filled torch staffs for cracking heads. As the election starts to lean into the war, kind of in the secession winter, Blair and some German Republicans take the wide awake movement and militarize it. They rename it as the Union organization, but it's still the same people. It's still these wide awakes from before the election, mostly local Germans. They buy carbines for them. They smuggle in rifles in all these kind of clever ways, and they use St. Louis's breweries, its bars, its warehouses to train all winter. You can kind of, locals say you can hear the tread of boots stomping around as these former wide awakes are now a militia, are now a paramilitary force. They've jumped from politics into warfare, basically. And when Governor Jackson, in the early months of the war, organizes a militia, which he says isn't for secession, but is really for secession, everybody knows, the wide awakes go and they capture that militia. And in the process of marching them back through St. Louis, these wide awakes that are now armed, that are now this Union force, getting into a fight with local Southern-leaning people in St. Louis, and they kill 30 of them. They start shooting into the crowd. They've got the rifles. They're the ones marching, and they kill a large number of civilians. It's the second bloodshed of the Civil War. The first bloodshed of the Civil War is in Baltimore, and it's those National Volunteers I mentioned before, this anti-wide awake offset organization helps organize an attack on Massachusetts troops. No one dies at Fort Sumter. People die in the streets of Baltimore and St. Louis in exactly the kind of political violence that the wide awakes had been organized to oppose, right? And the wide awakes are either perpetrators or their opponents are perpetrators in both these places. So I think we have this narrative of Fort Sumter as the beginning of the mythic Civil War, the war of cannons and forts and cavalry charges and bayonets. But the war starts in the streets, and it starts through politics. And these political organizations that become paramilitary organizations really begin the bloodshed of the war. Fort Sumter begins the war itself, but the way Americans start killing each other and hurting each other is through an escalation of an ongoing political process.
Yeah, and many of these wide awakes do enlist, right? They were volunteer. Yeah.
Yes, in huge numbers. So, yeah.
Please, yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to give a really concrete answer because we don't know how many wide awakes there were. The wide awakes we know about, I'd say probably 3/4 of them enlist that I came across, and half of Northern men of military age enlist, so they're overrepresented. The original Hartford wide awakes, most of them serve. 4 of the 5 originals serve. Eddie Jurgensen, he tries to sign up and his mother tells him not to, so he waits a year and he signs up a little later. Prominent wide awake speakers like Nathaniel Banks, like Cassius Clay, Carl Schurz, they serve. Ironically, a lot of these people who spend so much time talking to the wide awakes turn out to be the worst generals of the war. So giving a speech to a political club and actually winning on the battlefield are not the same thing. But in April, in May, in June, as people are forming to fight in the Union Army, whole companies of wide awake sign up. Wide awake captains become captains of companies. The early Union Army has many wide awakes in it. And in the South, certainly the militia members who form, they sign up in large numbers too. These are the first people into the fight in many places.
Okay, great.
And I should say that the generals like Grant wasn't a wide awake, but he had trained wide awakes in Illinois. Sherman wrote skeptically of the wide awakes. He kept saying this is not a fighting force. But so the people who emerge as the real fighters of the Civil War and the real victorious generals certainly had opinions on the movement as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We have a lot of questions and about 5 minutes to get through them. So I'm going to try to do some of this a little rapid fire. But Emily asks about how much the popularity of public like Zouave drill performances from Chicago to Washington City influence wide awake military protection performance aspects.
Yes, the Wide Awakes are a parallel organization. They're more explicitly partisan, but the same militarism, the same public spectacle that's motivating Zouaves and like Elmer Ellsworth and all these figures. It's all the same kind of culture, but the Wide Awakes are specifically partisan.
Okay. Dave asks a question about contemporary analogs. And I think there are a lot of different movements that might claim to be analogous or be inspired by, but they might have different functions or features. So he, for example, mentions like there are features of the Ku Klux Klan in terms of the uniforms and things like that, and the torches, or the Nation of Islam in terms of decorum and discipline. In your research, how much did you look at sort of modern analogs or groups that either were inspired by or, given how revolutionary the Wide Awake movement was at the time, how frequently that's been repeated, either intentionally or not, throughout American history?
Yeah. Honestly, I started seriously writing this book again after many years of thinking about it in 2020. And it was interesting. Sometimes the Wide Awakes looked like Black Lives Matter, and sometimes they looked like the Proud Boys. And it's easy to make the case for either side in that one. There are throughout American history these political clubs that use kind of public spectacle, often have membership, use symbols, costumes, uniforms, that kind of thing. The Wide Awakes are among the biggest. They're not as big as the Know Nothings were in the 1850s or the Second Klan was in the 1920s, but they're bigger than the Black Panthers, and then many of the political organizations that we think of when we think of kind of clubs with membership uniforms. The Wide Awakes are among the biggest and the most kind of cohesive and branded. The Second Klan is more branded and cohesive, but they're in the 1920s, so it's an entirely different consumer culture. They have parallels. They also have parallels with European movements, with revolutionary movements in the 19th century were fighting for liberation and democracy. There are parallels with fascist movements too. I mean, the fascist movements in the 20s and 30s in Italy, Germany, they have these roots in this revolutionary nationalism in the 19th century that the Wide Awakes are playing with too, and the power of militarism and spectacle. I'd say these symbols have been used for really different causes over the years. But it is interesting to see what connects with the public and what proves motivating. The different issues they're working towards are often very contrary.
Okay. Paul has a question that I think is also just perfect for us to cover here. He knows that the Sandwich Glass Museum in Massachusetts has a Wide Awake lantern that the company produced. Our collection has some Wide Awake torches and things like that in it, but I know you collect this. So what other Wide Awake artifacts are still in existence is his question.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but I have so much to say. After the Wide Awake movement is over, during the war, you see people using their capes for other things. Union soldiers use them to keep dry during rainy seasons. People cut them up to make textbook covers, fishing tarps, all these things. So a lot of the stuff doesn't survive. It's not too hard to understand how a movement of hundreds of thousands of people turned into the dozens of capes we know exist today. A few years ago in Milford, New Hampshire, in a small town in southern New Hampshire, they discovered a really beautiful Wide Awake cape in the attic. It's about 7 feet long and drapes over the shoulders. It has an open eye. It looks tan now, but we tested the paint, and it would have been bright white in 1860 with kind of violet lettering and like a purple eye. And it came with a torch, and the torch is marked 1860 for the first election it's used in. The wooden shaft of the torch is marched 1860, 1864, 1868, and for every presidential election it's used in from 1860 on through 1904, the owner, George Holt, marked it. So it's this incredible artifact of participation democracy over time, starting with the Wide Awakes. We collected at the Smithsonian. It's just about my favorite thing we have. Other places, the New York Public Library just recently collected that original cape that Eddie Jurgensen made, back in February 1860. They have that now, and that's incredible. They got an incredible collection of Lincoln objects recently. But they're out there. They're in. You seem to have plenty. They're in museums around the country. Certainly glass museums because they're the lanterns, torches. song sheets, wide awake songsters. The wide awakes printed up a comic book called Pips Among the Wide Awakes about how to join, basically how a 21-year-old could sign up for the wide awakes, in a kind of funny proto comic book. I've seen those in historical societies around the country. So they are out there, but it's diffuse.
Excellent. So we're out of time, but I'm going to squeeze in 2 more questions here, and I'm sorry that we're not getting to so many of the questions. There is a question about whether or not folks can get in touch with you, or if there's a way to do that. And so if we can provide that to them, that would be great. But also,
yeah,
so
email me. I'm happy to.
Okay, great. We could provide that. And then, so this is just an appropriate question about whether or not we're talking about these individuals as young people after they join the military or whatever, post-Civil War. Did any of them, what did their lives look like afterwards? And you do talk about in the book sort of like what their post-wide awake political career or life was like. If you can give just a highlight, maybe.
Yes, I'll do a highlight. I'm happy to go long if you want to stay, but I understand people have limitations. They take over the nation. I mean, the same people who join the wide awakes, who fight in the Union Army. If you look at Reconstruction America, look at Gilded Age America, these are the guys who, all those presidents, Republican Union veterans with beards from Ohio who run America in the late 19th century. These are the people who are wide awakes in 1860. 5 of the 9 presidents in the rest of the century either were wide awakes or spoke to and marched with wide awakes. They're wide awake senators, congressmen, governors, cabinet members, bank presidents, railroad presidents. I mean, they're also wide awake prisoners and escapees and on whaling vessels, and all throughout Gilded Age America, this kind of big, what they call the Yankee Leviathan that kind of dominates late 19th century America. These are the same people who were marching in the street when they were 19 for the wide awakes, basically. And they really are, in a way, they're so dominant in the post-war era that we almost don't see them because there are so many of them. I mean, the most striking example of this to me is Benjamin Harrison was a wide awake in Indiana. And when Benjamin Harrison is president in the 1880s, 1890s, he invites Eddie Jurgensen, the same Eddie Jurgensen who at 19 invented the wide awakes, to come decorate the White House. Jurgensen has become an interior designer. He's designed things for Thomas Edison, Teddy Roosevelt, Gatling, all these famous people. This guy who organizes the wide awakes is later in his life redecorating the White House for a wide awake president. He brings electric lighting into the White House for the first time. This is the guy who came up with the first wide awake torch and cape. So he had that spark of design, and it just shows how what was an embattled and grassroots movement in 1860, who really felt like they had a lot of grievance and were being walked all over, come to be the hegemons, the dominant force in American life in the late 19th century. It's really an amazing arc.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned that connection and that arc in particular with Jurgensen. I love that touch point in your book. So last question, what do you hope people take away from your book as they consider being responsible citizens in our, and I'm gonna quote your book here, noisy, confrontational, symbolic performance on the verge of a fight, end quote, country?
Oh God. First and foremost, that it's an interesting story. I really love history for history's sake, and I think it's important and instructive, but it's so fascinating the lives people have lived in the political organizations and these structures. So you don't need to take away behind that. But if you want to take away, I think the wide awakes help us honestly have a little bit of peace with the anxious moment we live in. That I think there's a sense in American political life that we have run into unprecedented tribal divisive politics, and that it is often leaning towards violence. And this is really ominous. I'm saying this is bad for democracy, right? But we also have a long history of people flirting with these movements, organizing these movements for good and for bad. And the thing I like about the wide awake so much is that they're organizing for what I feel is a pretty good cause. They're marching against slavery. Finally, after hundreds, centuries of slavery in America, here's the cavalry, that's finally standing up. But they're doing it in such an ominous, militaristic way that they also push these really dangerous buttons in American life. And I think, for those causes we support, maybe we can be a little more self-critical about the way we look to others and how we intimidate others. All of us could probably be. I think that's a good lesson for the wide awakes, but also that we've been in contested, even militaristic political moments in our past, and we haven't driven the democracy off the cliff. We have a legacy here we can learn from. And stories like the Wide Awakes help tell it. And also, lastly, the fact that the Wide Awakes are so forgotten tells me that there's so many more stories out there like this that we should be learning. That it's not just that the Wide Awakes are one great story and everything else is in the history books. Our past is really rich and really full. And the more we want to think about norms and democratic life, the more we should dig into all the other great stories out there as well.
Completely agree. That was so well said, John. And it was such a pleasure talking to you about your book. Thank you for joining us this evening. We can't wait to have you on. Do you have your next project, your next book project underway?
I'm kicking around a project, but it's too early to say. But yes,
well, keep us posted. We'd love to have
Yes.
you on again. Thank you all for joining us. And Phyllis, back over to you.
All right. Yes. Thank you again, John. At the rate the questions were coming in tonight, I think we could have probably gone on a lot more than an hour. So it was great. Next up, please join us on Thursday, October 10th for a great conversation with author and Lincoln expert, Dr. Alan Gelzo, on his latest book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln Democracy and the American Experiment. To register for all of our upcoming events, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. We have a full calendar of fourscore programming coming up for you, so please be sure and check it out. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, we thank you in advance for taking just a quick moment to complete a survey. As always, thank you to each of you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in October. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.